Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Politics in the Pub and the discussion, Indigenous Australians. The gap is not closing. Why? My name is Joe Nagy, and I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land on which we are gathered tonight, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and their leaders, past and present. We are privileged to have two expert speakers here. Andrew Meehan, National Director, Australians for Native Title and Reconciliation, and Dr. Tim Senior, a general practitioner at the Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Service in Campbelltown. Andrew Meehan has worked in senior policy positions in government and non-government organizations for almost 15 years. He is a strong believer in social justice with a particular focus on achieving social justice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people. His career involved the Indigenous rights policy and advocacy work at Oxfam, Australia, working as a senior advisor in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner within the Australian Human Rights Commission. He heads the policy work of a peak social housing organisation. He was chairperson of Shelter New South Wales for 3 years and has served on non-government boards.
Well, thanks very much for that. I'd like to start by acknowledging country, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. As was said in the introduction, I'm National Director of ANTAR, so many of you might be familiar with what ANTAR does, but for those of you that aren't, ANTAR has been working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, organisations and leaders on rights and reconciliation since 1997. We're dedicated solely to supporting justice, rights and respect for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We seek to persuade governments through advocacy to show genuine leadership and build cross-party support for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander rights. We're a non-government, not-for-profit, community-based organisation, and we focus on education and engagement of non-Indigenous Australians in particular, so that the rights and cultures of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are respected and affirmed across all sections of society. And we campaign nationally on a range of issues related to our mission, with a particular focus on health equality, constitutional recognition and incarceration. And we've been involved in the Close the Gap campaign for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health equality since its inception in 2006. So I'm very happy to talk to you on this topic tonight. What I thought I'd talk about is the state of the gap between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and non-Indigenous Australians, touch on some recent government responses to addressing this, particularly focusing on health and incarceration, and then make some observations about where I think things are going wrong. So the gap, to be clear, the gap referred to in Closing the Gap, or Close the Gap, is of course a relative term between, in this case, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and non-Indigenous Australians that refers to the level of disadvantage, often also to particular areas of disadvantage in health, housing, education, employment, etc. At the start though, I'd like to make a distinction, particularly as a member of the Close the Gap campaign, between Closing the Gap, which is government's policy framework, and the Close the Gap campaign. So both those phrases are often interchanged. The Close the Gap campaign is a human rights-based campaign for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health equality that was established by former Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner Tom Calma, and government's Closing the Gap approach entered the policy lexicon as a result of campaign activities and is used to describe both Council of Australian Government policies and the Australian Government policies aimed at reducing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander disadvantage. So with that distinction out of the way, what's the state of the gap? Professor Mick Dodson, and former Australian of the Year and Aboriginal leader, said that statistics have shortened life expectancy for our mothers, our fathers, our uncles, our aunties who live diminished lives. We die silently under these statistics. So whilst respecting that it is in fact people, families and communities we're talking about, I do think that statistics are useful to contextualise the issue, but also quite necessary in some ways to get a picture of the gap. They're of course not the whole picture and can be contested, but they nonetheless help us get a handle on what we're talking about. So I want to give a broad sense of the gap in a few areas, certainly not comprehensive, but more akin to a snapshot. And I'd also like to acknowledge that different areas of disadvantage are interrelated and are rarely usefully looked at in isolation. For example, education, employment and housing are all social determinants of health. In turn, if you're not healthy, it's harder to gain and maintain employment and further your education, etc. So first, to set the scene, the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander population was estimated in 2011 as being 670,000 people, which is 3% of the population. The Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander population is much younger than the non-Indigenous population. In 2011, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander population was aged, half of the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander population was aged 22 or under, compared to 38 or under for non-Indigenous population. And contrary to media depictions, and I'm sure many of you will know this, and as well as government attention, the majority, that is 80% of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, live in metropolitan or regional areas, with just 8% in remote areas and around 14% in very remote areas. And a third of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people live in major cities. So turning to the health gap, while there's a range of health indicators and measures that are commonly compared in relative terms to non-Indigenous population, I'll highlight just two, life expectancy and child mortality. So life expectancy is commonly used as a proxy for overall population health, and Tim will be in a much better position to explain that in more detail if he chooses. And child mortality is a key measure that impacts on life expectancy. So the estimated Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander life expectancy for men is 69.1 years, compared to 79.7 years for non-Indigenous men. It's 73.7 years for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander females and 83.1 for non-Indigenous women, a gap of about 10 years for both male and females. Life expectancy is estimated to have increased 1.6 years for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and 0.6 years for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women since 2005, a relative improvement of 0.8 years for men and 0.5 years for Aboriginal women. Regarding child mortality, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children aged 0 to 4 die at more than twice the rate of non-Indigenous children. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child death rates fell by 30% from 2001 to 2012, compared to a fall of 22% for non-Indigenous children. So of those two key measures of health, in recent years we've seen a minor improvement both in overall and relative terms, but a huge gap remains. With regards to housing, 36% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander households were homeowners or purchasers, compared to 68% of non-Indigenous Australians. Around 12% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander households were considered overcrowded, compared with 3% of non-Indigenous households. And the rate of homelessness for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people was 14 times higher than the rate for non-Indigenous Australians in 2011. Again, a huge gap in housing. On education, numeracy and literacy scores were lower across years 3, 5, 7 and 9, and around 50% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students stayed at school until year 12, compared to 80% of non-Indigenous population. But there has been some rise in retention rates since 1998. Overall, a large gap in education remains, but there have been some improvements in some areas. For example, in access to preschool education. On income and employment, 42% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people aged 15 and over are employed, compared with 61% of non-Indigenous people. 17% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are unemployed, compared with 5% of non-Indigenous Australians. Clearly an enormous relative difference. But perhaps the worst relative measure, and one that gets far too little attention, is incarceration. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make up 28% of the total prison population. That's a rate 14 times higher than non-Indigenous Australians. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, young people, it's worse. They're incarcerated 28 times the rate of non-Indigenous Australians. And unlike some of the other areas of disadvantage, there's been very little improvement in the last 10 to 20 years. In fact, there's been no improvement and it's gone backwards. The rate of incarceration increased between 2000 and 2010 by almost 59% for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and 35% for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men. And that gap is nothing short of a national crisis. So to try and pull what this snapshot of statistics tells us together, it's clear that across every social and economic indicator, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people fare a lot worse than other Australians. That is, there's an unacceptable disadvantage and equality gap. The gap or gaps have been there for as long as records have been kept and compared. There have been some small improvements in a number of areas, overall in relative terms, although in some cases probably not statistically significant changes, such as life expectancy and child mortality and education attainment, but little improvement in housing, income, employment, and of course going backwards in incarceration. And there are plenty of other measures that we could look at. Incarceration has gone backwards at a rapid rate over the past 10 years. So to sum up what these statistics are telling us, while there's been some improvement, small improvements in some areas, it's reasonable to say, as the title of the night is, that the gap isn't closing much, if it's closing at all, and in some areas it's going backwards. So how has government approached the relative disadvantage in recent times? And I want to look at just health and incarceration as two examples. And I'm going to try my hardest to be as non-partisan as possible. The reality is that all governments have failed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people over a long period of time. But I don't think I can let the recent heinous federal budget pass without comment, but I'll get to that. So in relation to health and government approaches to it, in 2007 the federal government agreed to the demands of the Close the Gap campaign to close the life expectancy gap within a generation, that is by 2030. It forged an agreement supported by a number of national partnership agreements within a Closing the Gap framework with the Council of Australian Governments, the state and territory governments. The opposition supported the Closing the Gap goal and broad approach. The Closing the Gap in Health National Partnership Agreement was accompanied by $1.6 billion in funding for health as part of an overall $4.6 billion in funding for the broader Closing the Gap framework. In mid-2009, the National Partnership Agreement on Closing the Gap in Health Outcomes began to be rolled out. While not all that was called for, in fact it fell short in many ways, in particular there was not enough engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the policy process and not enough support for Aboriginal community controlled health organisations, the broad approach was seen as heading in the right direction by many, particularly the framing around closing the relative disadvantage gap and setting time-bound targets. The most recent ABS statistics were the ones that showed up the small gains in life expectancy and child mortality since that approach started rolling out in 2009. However, last year the National Partnership Agreement on Closing the Gap in health outcomes was discontinued. Instead, in the recent federal budget, there were cuts to Aboriginal health programs of $165 million. and $130 million to anti-smoking programs, as well as a discontinuation of the Closing the Gap in Health and Early Childhood Development National Partnership Agreements. In addition, the overall approach and framework for policy was changed and refocused to what's now called Indigenous Advancement Strategy. There's uncertainty as to what programs will be continued and supported beyond next year under a new procurement and tendering process as part of that new Indigenous Advancement Strategy. And there's no clarity around how the government will meet its commitments to close the gap. So that's health. In relation to incarceration, the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the criminal justice system has been linked to issues of social and economic disadvantage, such as high levels of poverty, poor education outcomes, high rates of unemployment, high levels of drug and alcohol use, overcrowded housing, high rates of homelessness, and other issues. The increased representation is also, to a large degree, the result of tough on crime approaches and their disproportionate impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. For example, the failure of police to appropriately use their discretion in relation to minor offending by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people, inflexible and heavily restrictive bail conditions, the spread of mandatory sentencing and other punitive laws in the NT and WA in particular, compliance-based approaches to community supervision, particularly of parole orders, and significant numbers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in regional and remote areas being sentenced to imprisonment unnecessarily due to a lack of access to non-custodial sentencing options in these areas. All of those have had a disproportionate impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and resulted in a sustained increase in imprisonment rates. Governments continue on these tough on crime approaches despite constant calls from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and organisations such as the National Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Legal Services, the Aboriginal Family Violence Prevention Legal Services, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner to change the approach. That is, to change the approach to one of investing some of the enormous resources going into tough on crime approaches to the sorts of services and support that would address disadvantage, prevent offending, reduce incarceration and lead to safer communities. Such a justice reinvestment approach would support things like early childhood services and family support, school attendance programs, services for youth in crisis and their families, drug and alcohol and psychological counselling, diversion and cautioning by police and courts, community courts to engage elders and community leaders in the process, problem-solving courts like mental health and drug courts, improved public housing, community works programs as jail alternatives, and increased prison support and through care pre and post release, as well as parole that supports reintegration rather than just compliance and policing. And this approach would do so driven by the community, where the community decides what's needed. The government committed to setting targets to address incarceration prior to the federal election, but it's yet to act on that. Further, the key sources of such systems reform advice to government, as well as key service providers in this area, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Legal Services, Aboriginal Family Violence Prevention Legal Services, have lost $13.4 million and $3.6 million respectively in the recent federal budget. The National Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Legal Services is the national peak for legal services and has been completely defunded. 38 Aboriginal early childcare centres have also been defunded. At a state and territory level, tough on crime approaches, including measures that impact disproportionately on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, continue to be embraced. So where are things going wrong, if it isn't already becoming clear? Well, I think some of this is pretty clear, but in relation to government policy, programs and services, I'd make the following observations about what I've heard many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people call for. I've heard them call for approaches that respect their rights to self-determination. That is, approaches that empower and allow for local decision-making, that support Aboriginal community control, health organisations, legal services, violence prevention and childcare and other services to serve their own communities. Approaches that ensure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are real partners in all stages of the policy process. And approaches that ensure decisions aren't made without Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people at the table, and that ensure that real engagement rather than token consultation occurs. And I've also heard Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people call for approaches that recognise the level of need. If we're to close the gap in disadvantage, targeted allocation of resources is needed. Put simply, if 3% of the population can expect to live 10 years shorter than everyone else, then allocate resources accordingly. Give that part of the population a bigger part of the funding pie. And I've heard Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people call for approaches that are long-term and involve a level of continuity. It seems every time a new government comes in, they change the entire policy and practice framework and emphasise different areas of disadvantage. So this isn't an argument for keeping bad policies, but the chopping and changing of broad-based policies makes it impossible for small organisations, Aboriginal organisations, to plan long-term. It cuts across community development approaches, it limits community understanding of what the government is trying to achieve, and it makes it difficult for community to engage with. For example, who the hell knows what government's Indigenous advancement strategy is all about at a community level, or a national level for that matter? And who's going to tell people in the community about it? But I've also heard Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people call for holistic community development approaches that empower communities to identify what their priorities are, pool resources, and even make mistakes. Approaches that don't overburden small Aboriginal organisations with reporting against 30, 40 or 50 programmatic funding lines to various government departments. Approaches that address the root causes of disadvantage, including trauma, intergenerational poverty, dispossession and racism. That's what I've heard Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people call for from governments of all ilks. So why aren't we closing the gap? It seems quite simplistic, but I would say because government's not listening. They're not working with those that are best placed to decide what their needs are, what the solutions to issues are, and how best to deliver them. That is, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Government isn't recognising or working within a rights framework where the right to health, housing, education, employment and equality form the starting point for any government approach that seeks to progressively realise that right. And government isn't trusting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to make decisions about their own lives. And in my view, until it does, we're unlikely to see significant improvements in the gap. Thanks.